All right, so let's go back to our user input validation program. Now I've made some modifications here that I want to walk you through. This program here, instead of asking for a yes or no, a text-based answer like how I showed you before, this one's going to ask for some numerical input. So in this case, I'm going to prompt the user to enter a number from 1 to 10. And this would be useful, for example, if you have a menu. Say you have 10 choices on your menu and you want them to pick one of those choices. So you want them to enter the number of the choice instead of having to type out the choice itself. So we want to be able to check whether that number they enter is valid. So say they enter like 50, that's not a valid choice. And somewhere down the line, that's going to cause problems. So before we do anything else in our program, we'd want to check whether the number they enter is in the right range. Okay, so still the same basic skeleton as what I showed you in the previous example, but I made some changes here. So let's first take a look at those changes. So first, in the input statement, where I give the prompt, enter a number from 1 to 10, I've put another function around that. I've put this int function. You might recall that from CodeHS. The int function converts whatever the user types in to be explicitly a number. Kind of funny, Python has things called types of data. So you have what are called strings, just kind of random text. And then you have numerical values, so integers or ints, which are whole numbers, and floats or floating point numbers, which are decimals. And you have to kind of be careful in some instances about mixing and matching the different types. Like if you're expecting a number, but you get a string, and you try to do some computations with it, then you're going to run into problems. Or vice versa. If you're expecting a string and you get a number, and you try to do some string stuff with it, then you're going to run into problems. So when you're getting input and output, that's especially when you got to be careful with types. So when the Python interpreter accepts input from the keyboard, it's always going to treat it as if it's a string. Even if you just type in digits, like 1, 2, 3, it's going to still treat those digits as if they're kind of just generic text. So before you can do any kind of computation or comparison as if they're numbers, you've got to convert them to be numbers. And so the way we do that is we use this int function. And that will take whatever the user types in. Initially, it's treated as plain text, but then it'll convert it specifically to a number. Okay, so that's this int function here. So that user input, this variable here, will now hold a number as opposed to just a generic string, just a piece of text. Okay, now the other modification I made is in the if statement here. Now, initially before, we had it checking to see whether the input was yes or no. We had it checking the two options. Instead of doing that here, instead of checking for each individual option, like say is user input equal to 1, or is user input equal to 2, or user input equal to 3, all the way up to user input equal to 10, that's kind of a pain. You don't want to do that. Okay, imagine if you had a selection of say 100 things, you wouldn't want to do that out. So for numerical inputs, it's often better and easier to check, instead of each individual one, check a range. So like how I did here. So I'm checking to see whether user input is greater than or equal to 1 and whether it's less than or equal to 10. Okay, so sort of like in math when you have a compound inequality, that's kind of what's happening here. So if user input is greater than or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 10, then you know it's in the right range, and then you flip your Boolean flag variable to be true, then that will mean the next time it comes around to the top of the loop and checks, it'll no longer be valid, so it'll no longer be true, rather. So this condition will no longer be true, and it'll kick it out. Okay, so instead of doing each individual checking for each individual possibility, I can set it up like this. Okay, now be careful. Some people might think, oh, okay, in math, I learned that you could write a compound inequality like this. Now, Python, not quite math. You can't really do that. It's not going to be able to interpret that. So you've got to type it out kind of longhand the way I did here. So if user input is greater than or equal to 1 and user input is less than or equal to 10. So don't get too fancy thinking you can import all of your standard math notation. Sometimes you gotta write it out for it to be clear to the interpreter. Okay, so we do that. Okay, and then the last thing I did is when I print out the value here, just to verify the value, I use the str function. Again, this thing about types. So if we want to print out stuff, the stuff we want to print out has to be all text. It has to be all strings. And so user input is actually a number. So if I tried to do it without converting it to be a string first, try to print it out, Python would throw a fit again. Okay, again, it's the issue of types, which I know initially it's kind of a little bit confusing, but once you get used to it, it's not too bad, just to keep in mind when you have to change things and not. Okay, so I convert it to be a string. Okay, so let's try it out. So get my prompt, enter a number from 1 to 10. So let's first, we want to test it. We want to make sure we run it through all the different possibilities. So let's try a valid number. Let's try 5. Okay, so we know it kicks it out of the loop. It says thanks, and you entered 5. Okay, so that seems to work. Now let's try entering a number that's invalid, so like 100. Oh, okay, it keeps asking. So let me try 700 or 70. Let's try 1,000. Okay, so it'll keep asking, so it's behaving like how we want. It keeps asking until I enter a valid number, say like 7. Okay, then it says thanks, kicks me out of the loop, and tells me what I entered. Okay, now you also when you're testing, you also want to check your so-called edge cases. So those are ones where it changes from valid to invalid. So in this case, it'd be like 1, so the lowest possible number. Okay, so 1 works. And let's check 10. Okay, that's the other edge, the other place where it changes from valid to invalid, and that seems to work as well. Okay, so in this case, our validation seems to work. Okay, so this is what it would look like if you were checking, say, numerical data for a menu. Okay, now let me show you one more thing. Let's go back up here to this while loop. Okay, so I set the condition for the while loop to repeat is valid is false. So as long as our valid flag is false, so as long as we haven't entered valid input, it's going to keep repeating. Okay, now here's a little shortcut to doing this. So is valid equals false. Another way I could do that was to write it like this. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, not, you see it kind of prints it in a different color, blue. So that means it's a special word. Not is like a negative sign for Booleans. So like a negative sign will reverse a sign. So if you take negative of a positive number, you get a negative number. If you take negative of a negative number, you get a positive number. A negative sign basically switches the sign of a number. So not is sort of like a negative sign for Booleans. So it switches the value. So if something is true and you put a not in front of it, it makes it false. And if something is false, if you put a not in front of it, it makes it true. Okay, so it just reverses it. So another way I could have stated that condition is to do something like this. While not is valid. Okay, so if is valid is false, that means they haven't entered correct input. Not is valid will then be true, and so the while loop will keep repeating. Okay, if is valid is true, which means they have entered valid input, not is valid would be false, and so that would mean the while loop stops. Okay, so that may be a little confusing for you. If it is, then go back and you can use the old way we did it. If is valid equals false, comparison, and that'll also work. But I just wanted to show you that because sometimes you'll see that in other people's code. Sometimes you won't see like necessarily a condition here, but they'll just have like not something or a Boolean variable. And that's what's going on, because really this check here is really just true or false. So it's a Boolean value. You can express it either as like a comparison or as a combination of Boolean variables. Okay, so if that went a little over your head, just ignore that. Just keep in mind this. Just keep in mind or keep to this kind of basic condition here. Okay, so that's input validation for numbers.